Do you still remember hearing the milkman's bottles before dawn? Do you still remember the ice cream van's chimes carrying down the pavement on a Sunday? While Americans had highways and supermarkets, Britain still had terraced streets and doorstep deliveries, and this little van was built for exactly that world. Back then, the Bedford CA was the van that made Britain work. But today, the Bedford name is dead. A single factory in Luton churned out 370,000 of these vans across 17 years, from a massive plant that also built Churchill tanks and Vauxhall saloons on adjacent lines. Join me as we journey back in time to witness Britain's most iconic van simply evaporate, and find out why there will never be another Bedford CA. It is a dark story of wartime sacrifice, boardroom betrayal across an ocean, and a factory that was still profitable on the day they locked the gates. To understand why the Bedford CA mattered, you have to understand what Britain looked like in the years it was designed for. The country was still rebuilding. Petrol rationing had only ended in 1950. Meat came off the ration in 1954. Whole streets in London still had bomb sites where the rubble had not been cleared. The economy was tight, the roads were narrow, and almost everything a household consumed arrived at the door in the back of a small van driven by a man who knew his round by name. The milkman, the baker, the grocer's delivery boy, the post office engineer. Britain in the early 1950s did not run on supermarkets and family cars. It ran on small commercial vehicles, into curbs that European and American vans were never designed for. The market for a van that could turn into a Victorian terraced street, slide a door open without hitting a lamppost, and still carry half a ton of bottles, that market belonged to whoever could build the right vehicle for it. In Luton, that problem belonged to a man called Charles Bartlett. Bartlett had walked into General Motors' British subsidiary in 1921 as a bookkeeper. An accountant by training, not an engineer. He understood ledgers, fleets, and the small operators who bought vehicles by the dozen. The dairies, the bakeries, the local councils. The men who counted every gallon of petrol because in post-war Britain you had to. By the late 1920s, he was managing director of Vauxhall Motors. He had been there when General Motors acquired the company in 1925, buying a firm building just 17 cars a week and edging towards insolvency. He had been there when the old Vauxhall works on Wandsworth Road in South London was left behind, and everything moved to Luton. He had been there in April 1931 when General Motors established a new commercial brand, named it after the county, and called it Bedford. The first Bedford, a 2-ton lorry, was virtually indistinguishable from the Chevrolet it was based on. Bartlett spent the next 2 decades making sure the brand became something more than that. The war made him. Luton built more than 5,600 Churchill tanks alongside 250,000 Bedford lorries for the army, steel helmets by the 100,000, and components for half a dozen different machines of British survival. Then, on the 30th of August 1940, a German bomber found the plant. 39 Luton workers were killed on the factory floor in a single afternoon. 40 more were injured. Production resumed within days. The men who went back to the line the next morning were building the tanks that would eventually punch their way across North Africa, and they went back knowing exactly what the factory was costing them. In 1944, the King knighted Bartlett for it. The Luton site by then was something extraordinary in British manufacturing. Before the war, family cars and commercial vans had rolled off adjacent lines. When hostilities began, car production stopped, and the plant turned over entirely to war material. Churchill tank hulls in one shop, Bedford lorries in another, steel helmets and rocket bodies in a third. By the late 1940s, Sir Charles had a problem he could not knight his way out of. The Bedford PC van was visibly exhausted. The competition was not. Morris had launched the J-type in 1948, and the small van market was taking notice. Ford was still selling the ancient Fordson A83W, a design dating from 1938, but it was only a matter of time before Dagenham produced something modern. Bartlett was approaching 60. The replacement for the PC was going to be his last design decision, and he had to get it right. The brief he set was unusual for its time. Semi-forward control, with the driver sitting almost over the front axle. A wheelbase of just 90 inches, short enough to swing into the terraced streets the milkman and the baker worked every morning. A 1.5-litre, 4-cylinder petrol engine producing around 50 brake horsepower. Sliding side doors, a feature only Morris had attempted on the J-type, and Bedford's version was wider and better engineered for daily commercial use. And one decision that would define the entire commercial life of the vehicle: a separate chassis with a pressed steel body bolted on top. That last choice was deliberate. A separate chassis is heavier than a unitary body. It costs more to make. It is, by the standards of post-war passenger car engineering, old-fashioned. But it has one extraordinary virtue. You can take the body off and put a different one on. You can mount an ice cream freezer to it, build an ambulance on it, weld a camper conversion to its rails. The CA was built from the first sketch as a platform that coach builders across Britain could finish into 1,000 different things. The van launched in 1952. Fleet operators saw immediately what they were looking at. A milkman could step out at a curb without swinging a heavy panel into traffic. The thing was designed for the people who actually used it. It would take Ford 13 years to put it on the road. Bartlett would not live to see it. He took the Vauxhall chairmanship in June 1953, held it briefly, and died in August 1955. By then the CA was already a hit, but the clock that had started in Dagenham was still running, and the men celebrating in the Luton press shop could not yet hear it ticking. Walk into the Luton plant in 1958, and the first thing that reaches you is not sound, it is vibration. The press shop floor transmits the thud of steel being stamped a fraction of a second before your ears register it, a deep mechanical pulse you feel through the soles of your boots. Then the smell hits. Cutting oil from the machine shop, sharp and metallic. Cellulose paint drifting from the spray booths, sweet and chemical. The weight of a finished CA door panel as a man lifts it into a jig, heavier than you expect, the pressed steel cold against the palm. Vauxhall employed roughly 36,000 people at Luton in the late 1950s. What the CA became in those years was the working infrastructure of Britain. The post office bought them by the thousand. GPO telephone engineers drove them. Wall's ice cream put them on every promenade in the country. The mobile libraries that brought books to villages too small for a branch were CAS. The BBC's outside broadcast units were CAS. St. John Ambulance ran them. Bakers and greengrocers ran them. The thing proliferated quietly, the way useful objects do, until it had become invisible by virtue of being everywhere. By 1958, Bedford had introduced the long wheelbase CAL, 102 inches between the axles, wider doors, greater payload. They were iterating. They were listening to the people who used the thing. And then there was Folkestone. In the early 1950s, a man called Spencer Apps, who worked at a coach building firm in Kent called Martin Walter Limited, noticed something on the docks. People waiting for the cross-channel ferries were sleeping in their cars. Whole families curled into saloon seats, waking stiff at dawn. Apps looked at the new Bedford CA, at the chassis Bartlett had insisted on, at those generous sliding doors, at the flat floor a coach builder could do anything with. He saw what nobody at Bedford had quite seen. Martin Walter began converting CAs first into minibuses and basic caravans, and then, in late 1957, into something fully realized: a CA with fold-flat doormatic seats, a gas stove, a sink, fitted cupboards, and an elevating roof crowned by a red and white striped canopy. They called it the Dormobile. It became the post-war British family holiday revolution in pressed steel. Children remember the canopy going up at a campsite, the way other generations remember Christmas decorations. What strikes me every time I go back to this is the geography of it. The men who understood what the Bedford CA could really be were not in Luton. They were 120 miles away, in a coachworks on Tile Kiln Lane in Folkestone, run by people whose engineering qualification was looking at couples sleeping on a dock and asking why nobody had fixed it. The scale of what followed is the part most accounts skip over. By the late 1950s, Martin Walter was converting CAs at a rate Bedford's standard distribution network could not service. The solution was a logistical arrangement that I had to read 3 separate sources to believe. Bedford ran dedicated rail services from Luton direct to Folkestone, loading base vans straight from the factory onto rolling stock and unloading them at a siding inside the Tile Kiln Lane works. In 1959 alone, Martin Walter converted 10,000 Bedford CAs into Dormobiles or minibuses. 10,000 from a single coach builder. Bedford could not build CAs fast enough to feed the holiday boom one firm in Folkestone had created from watching couples sleep on a dock. If you've got a Dormobile memory of your own, your dad lifting that canopy at a Cornish campsite, or your grand's caravan at Breen Sands, leave it in the comments. These are exactly the stories that get lost otherwise. By the early 1960s, the CA had become so embedded in British commercial life that it was difficult to imagine the streets without it. In October 1965, Ford's answer arrived. The Transit had been developed under a program called Project Redcap, and the first production vehicle came off the Langley line in Berkshire in August that year. The commercial launch followed in October. It was a different machine in every meaningful respect, and the most important difference was structural. The Transit was a monocoque, no separate chassis. The body and the frame were one welded steel shell, lighter and stiffer than the CA's traditional construction, with car-like ride and car-like handling. There was something else, and this is the part that mattered for the corporate story underneath. In 1959, Henry Ford II issued a directive: one van for all of Europe. Ford of Britain and Ford of Germany each submitted rival proposals in January 1960. Britain won the pitch, a 50-page document against Germany's 6, and Project Redcap became a British-led program. But it was still a European program. Engines came from both sides of the Channel. Production was set up in Britain and in Germany simultaneously. One vehicle, 2 countries. British leadership. Bedford had no equivalent. Vauxhall in Luton and Opel in Russelsheim were both owned by General Motors, and General Motors in Detroit had not allowed them to work together on a commercial vehicle program. The 2 engineering teams, sitting 600 miles apart inside the same parent company, were forbidden from collaborating on the very vehicle that might have saved them. By the time GM understood what Ford had done, the Transit was on European roads, and the moment had passed. The Bedford CA, now 13 years old, was structurally outclassed the day the Transit arrived. Bedford's engineers understood what they needed. They needed a transit beater, and they needed it fast. The engineering skill was there, the factory capacity was there, the will to fight back was there. What had begun to shift, in a way nobody on the factory floor could see, was the question of where the decisions about that vehicle would actually be made. The CA's last years were quiet. Production wound down through the late 1960s. The final example left the line in 1969 with no ceremony. 370,000 vans across 17 years, and the last one rolled out of the press shop into a Luton afternoon and was forgotten by lunchtime. The replacement was already in the building. The Bedford CF launched in November 1969. Forward control, modern silhouette, a cleaner look than anything Bedford had built before. From the outside, it looked like the transit beater Bedford had needed. Then you opened the bonnet. Inside the CF was the Vauxhall Slant 4, an engine introduced in the FD Victor passenger car in 1967. An overhead cam unit designed for a family saloon. Torquey enough on paper, but rough running and never intended for commercial use. Bedford had not commissioned a new heavy-duty unit for the CF. They had reached for what GM already had on the shelf, and the part they reached for was a car engine. Commercial vans in 1969 ran on heavy, low-revving lumps with iron blocks and timing chains. A timing chain is steel links running in oil. It rattles, it stretches over years, and when it does fail, it usually gives you warning. The Slant 4 did not have a timing chain. It had a toothed rubber cam belt, an innovation borrowed from passenger car engineering. Designed for a family, Victor doing 30,000 sedate miles a year and being serviced by a main dealer. Now put that engine in a post office van doing 80,000 stop-start miles a year, driven flat out between letterboxes, serviced by whichever depot mechanic was free that morning. Fleet drivers did not check cam bolts. Fleet managers did not know to schedule cam bolt replacement. The belts snapped. And because the Slant 4 was an interference engine, meaning the valves and the pistons occupied the same space at different moments in the cycle, when the belt let go, the valves smashed into the pistons. You did not get a misfire. You got a destroyed engine. A vehicle that was a write-off at 60,000 miles on the side of an A road with a load of parcels in the back. This happened thousands of times. When I was reading through the trade press from the early 1970s, I had to double check this because I assumed at first that the engine problems must have surprised the engineers. They did not. Internal complaints from fleet customers reached Vauxhall almost immediately. The Slant 4's limitations in commercial use were known inside the building within months of the CF's launch. The engineers who had built the CA on a brief that listened to operators were now selling those same operators a van whose central component had been chosen for them by someone reading a balance sheet. It was a constraint, not an accident. Word got around fleet managers the way these things always do. By the mid-1970s, ordering a CF instead of a Transit was something a procurement officer had to defend in writing. The Transit, with its plain old iron block engines, simply kept going. The CF did not. This was the real reason Ford won the British van market. A car engine in a van body against a van engine in a van body. The argument lasted exactly as long as it took fleet operators to start counting their write-offs. In Detroit, a man called Edward Cole had become president of General Motors in 1967. Cole was an engineer's engineer. He had designed the Chevrolet small block V8. He looked across the Atlantic at General Motors, 2 European operations, and saw waste. Vauxhall in Britain and Opel in West Germany were duplicating engineering, design, and manufacturing functions across a continent that had already become a single market in everything but name. Opel was larger. Opel was more profitable. The logic was inescapable. Where the two operations overlapped, Rüsselsheim would win. Cole did not set out to destroy Bedford. He set out to rationalize a conglomerate. The effect over time was the same. Through the 1970s, program by program, the center of gravity moved from Luton to Rüsselsheim, not in a single decree, but but in committee minutes, budget allocations, and quiet decisions about which team would get the next platform. The CF van, launched in 1969, would later be confirmed as the last vehicle solely designed by Vauxhall. By 1979, the HC Viva, the last true Vauxhall passenger car, went out of production. The new Astra, launched the following year, was a rebadged Opel Kadett. By 1980, every new vehicle wearing a Vauxhall badge had been designed in Germany. The Transit dominated. Through the 1970s, the CF finished a distant second in the British light commercial market and never closed the gap. It survived only in the niches the Transit could not serve, such as ice cream van conversions, ambulance bases, and bespoke coach work. The CA's old advantage, a separate chassis a coach builder could do anything with, had become its successor's last lifeline. In 1981, Roger Smith became chairman of General Motors. Smith inherited a corporation in financial crisis. His mandate was clear: cut costs across the entire General Motors operation. He was not hostile to Britain. Britain simply, in his spreadsheets, had the wrong numbers. Quick favor while I have got you. If this is landing, hit subscribe. There is a whole stack of these stories nobody else is telling, and the channel only works if the people who care about it are actually here. Under Smith, the rationalization that coal had begun became terminal. Bedford's heavy truck range, the TK dating from 1959, was too far behind Mercedes-Benz, DAF, and Volvo to save. The Dunstable plant closure was announced in 1986. The heavy truck operation was divested in 1987 as AWD Trucks, sold to a businessman so-called David Brown, and it disappeared a few years later. The CF needed a successor. It did not get one. What it got was the Bedford Midi, launched at Luton in 1985, a rebadged Isuzu Fargo, built at a newly formed joint venture called IBC Vehicles. The CF was phased out from 1986. The last vehicle solely designed by Vauxhall went out of production with no replacement of its own. The Bedford name was still on vans rolling out of Luton. Vauxhall Cavaliers were still being built on the car line next door. To anyone driving past on the M1, nothing visible had changed. What had changed invisibly was that the name above the door no longer corresponded to anything inside the building. The badge was a memory adhered to a foreign chassis. The answer, as it turned out, was 35 years. But not for the reasons anyone in Luton would have wanted to believe. The Bedford brand was retired in 1990. 59 years after the first 2-ton lorry left the press shop in April 1931. GM rebadged the remaining light vans as Vauxhalls and Opels and let the name disappear in a trade press announcement. There was no ceremony. The county that had given Bedford its name was not consulted. What followed at Luton was the strangest period in the plant's history. The site became a ghost factory, not empty because it was running flat out. The vans still wore Vauxhall badges. The workers still clocked in for Vauxhall. But Luton had stopped designing anything of its own. IBC Vehicles continued. GM bought out Isuzu's share in 1998. From 2001, Luton built the Vauxhall Vivaro on a platform shared with the Renault Trafic and the Nissan Primastar. All three were the same van, same shell, same chassis, same line, just different badges screwed on at the end. So the men in Luton were building Renaults and Nissans and Vauxhalls on the same shift, knowing perfectly well that Renault and Nissan were Vauxhall's direct competitors in every showroom in Britain. Then Fiat joined in. Then PSA's acquisition added Peugeot and Citroën versions. By the late 2010s, a single plant in Bedfordshire, on a site that had once built Bedford trucks, Vauxhall saloons, and Churchill tanks under one roof, was producing essentially one van wearing 6 different badges for 6 different brands that competed against each other. The Vectra line had closed in 2002, ending car production at Luton entirely after 77 years. Here is the thing the workers in Luton were not told. General Motors had killed the Bedford brand and erased Vauxhall's design autonomy across 2 decades. But General Motors did not lock the gates. They sold Vauxhall to the PSA Group in 2017 and walked away after 92 years. PSA kept Luton open. Stellantis, formed in January 2021 from the merger of PSA and Fiat Chrysler, kept Luton open. Neither did so out of loyalty. Luton stayed open for 35 years after the Bedford brand was killed because the plant was profitable. That was the entire reason. When the calculation changed, it changed for several reasons at once. The United Kingdom's zero-emission vehicle mandate raised the cost of internal combustion production at exactly the moment Stellantis was rationalizing its global manufacturing footprint. Stellantis decided to consolidate British van production at Ellesmere Port on Merseyside. Carlos Tavares, the Stellantis chief executive, who had presided over the closure decision, resigned on the 1st of December 2024. None of the public reasons quite captured the truth. Luton was profitable on the day it was closed. It had just been retooled to build the new electric Vivaro. The workforce had been told for years that the electric program was the plant's future. The plant did not close because it failed. It closed because inside a global mega corporation balancing its books across 4 continents, a profitable British factory had become inconvenient. The closure was announced on the 26th of November 2024. The final van, a Vauxhall Vivaro, came off the line at 12:18 on the 28th of March 2025. The plant formally closed in April. Approximately 1,100 workers lost their jobs. Up to 3,700 more positions in the regional supply chain were placed at risk. Gary Ray, the Unite plant convener, said the closure had been in the pipeline for a long time, and that management had been deceiving a highly productive workforce. Sharon Graham, Unite's general secretary, said publicly that shutting a profitable Luton factory, just as it had been made ready to produce electric vehicles, made no sense. One worker said only this: "It is not just the people who work here, it is their families too." Here is what I find genuinely painful about this period. The men who lost their jobs in the spring of 2025 had never built a Bedford. Many had spent their careers building one shared van that wore 4 or 5 different badges for 4 or 5 different European brands. The name above the gate where they clocked in had been hollowed out for longer than some of them had been alive. That is what 35 years of managed decline looks like from the inside. Not a single closure, not a single villain. A slow, profitable, deliberate erasure that ends one quiet Friday in March when a Vivaro rolls off a line and nobody comes back on Monday. The CA vans themselves are still out there. Restored Dormobiles appear at vintage rallies in pub car parks. Ice cream vans line seaside fronts in August. The chimes still working, the sliding door still sliding. Owner clubs hold meets on summer Sundays. Men in their 60s lifting canopies they first saw their fathers lift. Stand outside the gate at Luton today. Close your eyes. Hear the press shop in October 1962. The deep mechanical thud of steel being stamped. The cellulose paint drifting from the spray booths. The cutting oil sharp in the back of your throat. A Bedford lorry chassis on one line. A Vauxhall Cresta waiting on another. A Bedford CA sliding door being lifted into a jig by a man who has been at Luton since the brand began, running his thumb along the edge to check the press. Open your eyes. A locked gate. a cleared site behind the hoardings. General Motors arrived in 1925 and stayed for 92 years. They killed the Bedford brand. They moved the design work to Germany. They kept the lights on as long as the numbers worked, then sold the company to PSA in 2017 and walked away. Stellantis locked the gate. But the long, quiet erasure that emptied Luton of everything except its skilled hands was already done by the time the final padlock went on. The Bedford CA never got a monument. We built it, we drove it, we forgot it. It made Britain work, and that should have been enough.